was looking forward to it, and I'm still going to do this at some point, but looking at what soul winning is not, okay, because there's a lot of different types of soul winning out there and different philosophies towards soul winning. And so I just want to address that. And of course, I know we're all on the same page here, so it might even seem like it's not necessary to do that, but I'm still going to do it at some point. But I changed my mind on that, and I was going to wait a little bit on this, but I think I'm going to go ahead and do it tonight instead. We're going to talk about the office of a deacon. Now, I've already made mention here recently that I've been talking to Brother Allen, and many already know about my thoughts in regards to making him a deacon. And soon we'll have a day where we, kind of officially work to that end. But in leading up to that, I want to talk about what it's all about, as well as share my vision for the church and the concept of planning churches and all that, which I know I've in the past said different things and talked about this before, but some of these things are subject to change a little bit based on what's going on, and so as far as my plans and all that. A few years ago, I remember doing a similar thing that I'm going to do up here, and I remember talking and specifically just talking about somebody that we had at the time who I had planned on making a deacon, and afterwards it was kind of like, I don't know, that's a lot of commitment and all this kind of stuff, and then they're not even here anymore, so it's kind of just a couple more years went by, and I feel like now we're ready to start talking about that again with somebody who has a desire to do so, and we'll see where that goes. But I want to go ahead and explain my philosophy and what I think about biblically of the office of a deacon, and then I'll at the end of the lesson talk a little more specific about our church, okay? So we're doing this in a handout fashion. In Iola, I've already talked about these things in Sunday school for the last couple weeks, and that's not live streamed, so none of you all have been able to see that, but we've been talking to just kind of preparing Iola for where I am, make sure we're all on the same page before we go forward with that, and now I want to bring that to you. So I'm going to use this handout. I've changed a few things on it, but we're just going to look through this, cover all this, and then I'm going to go on to, like I said, more personally talking about this work, which unfortunately this is a day where not a whole lot of people showed up. Here lately we've been having a lot of attendance. I mean, it's always so nice to look out and feel like the pews are full, and hey, we're going to have to start figuring out where we're going to put people. And so then the one day that I talk about personal things, people aren't here, but that's all right. Hopefully they can tune in, or hopefully some of them are tuning in, or they can watch it later, okay, because it's going to be important for us. Okay, so I have talked about many times about the qualifications of a bishop, an elder, and here's your first blank, pastor. Okay, we usually in a Baptist church just say pastor because elder and bishop sounds like maybe a different denomination or something. Nothing wrong with using those words. We seem to focus on the word pastor whenever we're talking about this, but I believe these titles are interchangeable. The office of a bishop, elder, pastor, I believe those just speak to the characteristics of their job, okay? And so I've already preached on that, so we're going to leave that alone for now. Okay, we want to talk about another office that's mentioned in the Bible, and there's not a whole lot of mentions here, but it is mentioned. There are qualifications given, and so we're going to talk about those. And let's go to Philippians 1, and I'll show you this idea. Now, growing up, independent fundamental Baptist, and over the years, some things have kind of been crystallized, and this is the way we do things as independent fundamental Baptist. And of course, I don't try to run the ministry based on what I've been taught as an independent fundamental Baptist, but what the Bible teaches. And so I got to be careful that there's some things that, why are we doing this? At years and generations, we don't understand why we do some of the things that we've always done. You don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but there are some times you have to look at things and say, well, why exactly are we doing what we're doing? But historically, Baptists have taught that there's two offices, that the Bible talks about, which is the office of the pastor and the office of the bishop. Or pastor, the deacon. So you got pastor, bishop, elder, and then you have a second office, which is called the deacon. Now, obviously, the word office is in the Bible a lot more times than that. All of us, office just has to do with the official business being done, so obviously there's different positions in a business, and there's probably a lot of things that you could call an office. But the reality is, in the Bible, we see two positions where qualifications are given, and it seems to be like, hey, these are the requirements for those people who are going to lead and have the authority over the church. And here in Philippians 1, we see a letter being written to the church, and he uses these two words. It says, Paul and Timotheus, the servants of Jesus Christ, to all the saints in Jesus Christ which are at Philippi, with the bishops and deacons. Okay, so that seems to be two specific groups of people or offices that are mentioned to this church at Philippi. Now, if you research the etymology of the word deacon, and of course it's one of those weird words that in the translation of the Bible, they just left it alone. Okay, there's a lot, even baptized is one of those things. Instead of trying to interpret it, the King James translators just pretty much left it alone. The word is not really changed that much from the Hebrew or the Greek, but what we understand is that word means servant. Okay. Now, a while back, I made a mistake, and I was just talking to somebody about this, but, you read so much and study so much. Even when I was in Bible college, they gave me so much material from men who aren't King James only. And so you start getting these things in your head from what you were taught. And I could have sworn that the Bible used the word deaconess at some point. I just thought that it did. And so I was saying, well, it just means servant. And obviously there were women in the church who were servants as well, and the Bible actually calls them deaconesses. But the thing is that King James never uses that word. What I was reading from other men was this one place, which I think is also in Philippians, where, or maybe it's, I can't remember, but anyway, it talks about somebody who is the servant of the church. Okay, and so a lot of people have just taken upon themselves to translate that into deacon or deaconess. The King James didn't do that. Okay, so take that for whatever it's worth. But the idea of having a servant, and then this position of somebody who is a servant in the church. But as you'll see, it's an honored position, and it's a position that is important for the authority of the church. But yet, it's still the idea of being a servant. Okay, which, by the way, a pastor is a servant as well. And so it's not this idea, and I'll talk about this probably more later, but, a long time ago, I started this kind of it was a website. I also did a little blog and talked about this subject when I was an assistant pastor who was trying to obey the authority of my pastor, and I called it second man. And so that's a word that's thrown out of there a lot, and you'll understand why we use that term and what is meant by that. But in reality, there's a certain sense in which I don't like that concept, because we're all just serving the church and we're lifting each other up and edifying one another. But there is a certain chain of command as far as authority, just like kind of in the family. I think I can make this comparison. In the family, you got the husband, and then you got the wife, and then you got the children. Like, there's a certain order, but nobody's like of more value than the other person or something like that. But anyway, but the idea is a pastor is also, and anybody in leadership, when we're talking about Christianity, anybody in a position of leadership, it shouldn't ever be, I'm just ruling over them and I just want to have my way and do whatever I want to do. We're serving Christ. He's the head of the church. And so anybody in a position of authority, the idea should be to serve them, okay? And here's proof of that, Matthew chapter 20. And I think it's a common sense principle, but the reality is there's so many people who have this model of like monarchy and this model of the CEO of a company, and at some point, well, I guess nowadays even the CEO of a company would probably say something similar. Hey, I'm just serving all the employees or whatever. But Jesus points this out, Matthew chapter 20, verse 25. Verse 25. He says, but Jesus called them unto him, and because they're fighting over who's going to be the most important in the kingdom, who's going to be first. He said, ye know that the princes of the Gentiles exercise dominion over them, and they that are great exercise authority upon them. But it shall not be so among you, but whosoever shall be great among you, let him be your minister. And whosoever will be chief among you, let him be your servants, even as the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister and to give his life a ransom for many. So the offices of the church, as far as anyone in authority, is an office of servanthood. It's an office of just being there for the people, ministering to them. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit as far as how to treat those in authority. But the reality is, from the perspective of those leading, they're just servants. Okay, so although I say that anyone in a position of authority is a servant, we also understand that in the governing structure of the church, the deacon is under the authority of the bishop or pastor, and then those who would delegate into other positions under that, which I'll get to whenever I draw on the board here, would be under the authority of that deacon and under the authority of that pastor. That's just the way that it goes. Again, just like husband, the head of the house, doesn't make him a tyrant or just like that he's not caring or concerning about the family. No, he's a servant to his family as well. So it's a similar kind of a thing here. All right, so in that next blank there is overseer of the church. Okay, so obviously he's got to have the authority because it's his job to be the overseer of the church. Now we see what seems to be the first institution of this office of the deacon in Acts chapter 6. Although it doesn't use the word deacon, we can kind of read between the lines here, and I'll talk more about that here in a second, but go ahead and go there to Acts chapter 6. Acts chapter 6. Verse 1 says, "And in those days when the number of the disciples was multiplied, there arose a murmuring of the Grecians against the Hebrews, because their widows were neglected in the daily ministration. Then the 12 called the multitude of the disciples unto them and said, It is not reason that we should leave the word of God and serve tables. Wherefore, brethren, look ye out among you 7 men of honest report, full of the Holy Ghost and wisdom, whom ye may appoint over this business. But we will give ourselves continually to prayer in the ministry of the word. And the saying pleased the whole multitude." Now, again, I want to point out this. I don't know how long ago it was, but I preached a message where I laid out a little bit about I think I did here. Maybe I'm thinking back to that Sunday school lesson in Iola. But the early church was pretty much just one congregation that was growing. Obviously, people are scattered abroad, but if you wanted to meet, you'd go to the temple or you'd go find the other brothers and sisters, because it was just pretty much, they weren't scattering abroad until like 2 chapters after this, when there's persecution among the church and they're kind of forced to go into Samaria and the rest of Judea. At this time, it was pretty much there in Jerusalem. And even though people were getting saved and they were spreading around and the disciples are growing, they're not really spreading out to a huge degree. They're just still there primarily in Jerusalem. So anyway, with this huge church, if you will, and all these people that are wanting, help from the church, and we already read that they were like selling their possessions, and everybody's just kind of all on board, right? They don't even own anything. The church is distributing and taking care of them, which I don't think was a wise idea, and I don't see where God ever told them to do that, but that's just what they had on their heart. Barnabas, had a lot of property and wanted to put that to the church, and it seems like people got to this position where, it's not socialism, because it's not like the government enforcing it upon people, but the church ran with this idea and this principle of equality, and so the leaders of the church are trying to be responsible for making sure people are taken care of. And it says that in the daily ministration that the widows, there were some widows that seemed to be being neglected. And so the Grecians are coming to the disciples and they're complaining about this. And they said, hey, we need to do something about it. And here's what we can do. We can appoint 7 men that will take on some of these responsibilities so that we can commit ourselves to ministering of the word and to prayer and to those things. Okay? Now, obviously, there's some things that that's not going to line up completely with today, churches today, because this was the start of some of the church, and this was they're trying to put some things into practice and all that. And so it's possible that I would say certain policies and particular qualifications that we see in 1 Timothy weren't necessarily enforced and in place at this time. And so therefore, this office where they were called deacons, we don't really see that yet. You see it later in the book of Acts, but you don't see it right here. And there are certain things that are still trying to be figured out. Okay? Which, by the way, it's another one of those areas where I feel like as churches we have liberty to decide how exactly we're going to conduct ourselves as a church. Again, what you're going to see, my vision is right here. So we have a little bit of liberty. There's nothing spelled out in the Bible that says this is the way you've got to do it. Okay, but there are some principles we want to draw from, make sure we're in the parameters of the Bible. And so I think this is a good thing to see what the early church kind of went through. We could look at the Catholic Church and see where it ended up. You know what I mean? And some of these people ended up. But we're not interested in how things progressed in the 2nd century, 3rd century. We want to look at what happened in the 1st century, okay? And then see where we can go from there. So let's see here. But the deacons, even these 7, they're just kind of throwing out a handful of qualifications here. They said they need to be men of honest report, full of the Holy Ghost, and full of wisdom. Okay, so we want to make sure they're honest men, trustworthy. They got a reputation for that. They're full of the Holy Ghost and they're full of wisdom. They're men that we're going to be able to trust to these jobs. And I'll talk a little bit about Stephen and Philip, which were 2 of those deacons here in a minute. Okay, so here are some general thoughts we can derive from Scripture about the office of a deacon. Number 1. The responsibilities and the services provided by the deacons, okay? In many ways, a deacon, from my estimation, what I'm reading into this and seeing is that he seems to be an extension of the pastor. It's your blank right there. He's an extension of the pastor. Therefore, they can share many responsibilities that are dedicated to them, which would normally be responsibilities of the pastor. Okay, so number 1, evangelism. Now we see this in the text really clearly. Stephen and Philip, for example, are they're headed right into evangelism, and I believe the whole church is involved in evangelism. I'll get to that here in a second. But we specifically see Philip was an evangelist. Look at Acts chapter 21. Again, this is sometime later. Chapter 21, verse 8. And the next day, we that were of Paul's company departed and came unto Caesarea. That's where Philip ended up. And we entered into the house of Philip the evangelist, which was one of the 7, and abode with him. Okay, and then it says the same had 4 daughters, virgins, which did prophesy. And so we learn a little bit about Philip. He was married, had children. He was involved in evangelism. I mean, these are good things, that we would want of a deacon for sure. We also see that Stephen, go all back to Acts chapter 6, right after these 7 men are appointed, it's not like their only job was to serve the tables. You know what I mean? It's not like they only had this one job. Every church service, then they're responsible for this part of the service, or they're responsible for, it's nothing like that. We see them immediately involved doing the work. And so Stephen is out and he's preaching. Acts chapter 6, verse 8. And Stephen, full of faith and power, did great wonders and miracles among the people. Then there arose certain of the synagogue, which is called the synagogue of the Libertines, and the Cyrenians and Alexandrians, and of them of Cilicia and Asia, disputing with Stephen. And they were not able to resist the wisdom and the spirit by which he spake. And so we understand then, of course, chapter 7, he's delivering this great message, and then that persecution of Stephen is what spurs everybody to just go out and start spreading. And then after that, it becomes churches, plural, okay, independent works that are spread out among all Judea, Samaria, and the othermost parts of the world. So we see then Stephen was an evangelist. Philip was an evangelist. We don't know anything about the other 5 men. Now, whereas I believe all members of a church are qualified to share the gospel, even if they're not members of the church, we wouldn't stop anybody from going out there and preaching. I think I've proven that. I didn't even stop Dan. Whenever Dan would, you guys know who I'm talking about, most of you, when he was going manic, and sometimes he'd be out there with tracts, and I'm just like, what am I going to do? Like, I could go physically find him and stop him, but eventually somebody would call and say, hey, you got a man out here who's obviously something's not right. I never had anybody like say, I can't believe you guys believe this or you do this. No, they understood that there wasn't something right. But who knows how God used that? He could have brought somebody to a point of, considering some questions or considering the whole situation or appreciating the fact that he was there trying to share the gospel with them. I'm not going to stop people from preaching the gospel. But as far as what we do as a church organized together and we go out, it seems only common sense that we would want somebody to be an authority over that and to lead that and have it, to be accountable for what we do as a church when we meet together and we go out. And so, I believe that a deacon would be a person who could lead that up, and oversee that in the pastors, given the pastor's authority. Okay, number 2, baptism of believers. I think this is something a deacon certainly can do if the pastor delegates that to him. Of course, we see in Acts chapter 8 when Philip is out preaching and he meets the Ethiopian eunuch. The Ethiopian eunuch gets saved, and right there in the water that's nearby, Philip takes him down to the water and he baptizes him. And so we certainly see that a deacon can, under the authority of the church, directed by the pastor, he is able to do that, and there's nothing wrong with that. All right. Also, of course, and we don't see a whole bunch of clear examples of this, although we could look at that Stephen when they went to his house and he was offering hospitality to them. We could see visitation and counseling and hosting guests. Hosting is your blank there. Hosting guests over at their house or at the church. Here's the thing for me. Like, I love the idea that I know there's a guy who, if I can't be here or somebody's from out of town and they're coming through, I can just trust the guy that he's going to take care of things. He's going to make sure this family's taken care of. He's going to be able to provide good counseling, and I don't have to stress about like, oh no, what's he going to do or what's he going to say, because he's proven himself to be somebody who can do that. So visiting, counseling, hosting guests, again, anybody can do these things, but I'm talking about as far as a representation of the church and under the authority of the church, that's a good job for the deacon. Also, of course, handling of money. We see that in this simple, Acts 6 idea of them going out and being able to feed and take care of, or whatever the ministering was, to these widows. The authority was given to these deacons. So to me, this is the office that many churches have come to call assistant pastors. You see that blank in C. To me, it's interchangeable, assistant pastor and a deacon. Now, the funny thing about that is, like, I've been in churches and I've seen a lot of places where an assistant pastor is a totally separate thing that's not even a biblical thing. Therefore, they don't even require them to have the qualifications of a deacon. How about a youth pastor, which basically would be an assistant pastor, right? He's giving them authority to work over. And then you have somebody who's a youth pastor who's not even married, or something like that. And you're like, whoa, this guy, we're giving them the authority of the church, Seem like he should have the qualifications of, maybe not the pastor, which we'll see here in a minute that the qualifications of a pastor and the qualifications of a deacon are almost the same. It doesn't make sense to me that you have, in a lot of places, you got pastor and then he's got his assistant. And then you've got deacons, which create, in a lot of churches, this board that basically it's like the deacons and then the pastor and then the assistant pastor. You know what I mean? The deacons are running the show, telling the pastor what he can do and can't do. And then all of them have authority over what the assistant pastor can do. Not at all what I see in the Bible. I see you got pastors, and then these pastors delegated to these other men, which were called deacons, which I'm fine with people calling them assistant pastors, or there's other names that people give them to them. I'm fine with that. But I just want you to know when I say deacon, that's what I'm talking about. Somebody who is basically an extension of the pastor. He's an assistant pastor, okay? And ideally, it makes sense to me, let me bring this one up, that the deacon is somebody who is supported financially by the church. Now, again, in a lot of churches, the people that get elected to the office of the deacon are the ones who have the money, because they're the ones that are invested in the church, and the people just tend to vote for them whenever it comes time to elect officers. And so, hey, we want them to be the deacons, and they're the guys that are controlling the money because they're financially stable or whatever. I've never been in a church where the deacons were paid, but again, assistant pastors are, and I feel like that's what the office of a deacon actually is. So ideally, in a perfect world, I would say that the church would be, paying these deacons, this assistant pastor, to fully dedicate himself to the work. But I know we don't live in a perfect world, and a lot of pastors don't even have that ability. A lot of bivocational pastors nowadays. And I would say this, that in a kind of church like I'm about to point out here, and the kind of church that we are part of right now, like if that was a continual thing, if we saw more pastors like that in our society today, I bet you the majority of them would be bivocational, just because it's just the reality of how it works out. A lot of churches, it seems like it just becomes this thing like, you go and you basically put an application before this church, and then you have to have this interview, and then, it's like they'll pay you this much, and then, maybe after you get your foot in the door, get some experience, this bigger church, they're looking for a pastor in a few years because their pastor's getting old, and maybe you can step up into that church, and it becomes this weird like vocation, this job that people are doing it for money. Whereas a lot of times the church like this, it's just like, hey, I don't care about all that. I don't care about the, stepping stones till I can get a bigger job and have a bigger office and all that. No, we're just going out doing the work and trying to start new churches. A lot of times that ends up being a situation where they're bivocational. Okay, so we understand that that's probably naturally going to be the case of the assistant pastors as well. But in an ideal situation, I think churches should plan and prepare and try to get to a point where they can, some of that money that's coming in through the tithes and offerings is going to secure that job for that deacon who has got a family, and I'll point that out here in a minute. They should have a family, and so therefore that family needs to be taken care of. You want them to be able to dedicate their time to the church as well. Okay, so that's an ideal world. That's what I think should happen. Now, the qualifications of the deacon, I'll go through them real quickly. But what you'll find here in that blank, it says the qualifications are very similar to that of a pastor. So go ahead and go to 1 Timothy 3, and I'll just read this. I decided not to read it at the beginning, but I'll read it to you now. 1 Timothy 3, I'm going to start at the beginning where it talks about the pastor. And then Titus, of course, gives pretty much the same thing. Now, it uses bishop and elder interchangeably in Titus, and it doesn't mention the deacon. But here we see in 1 Timothy 3, this is a true saying, if a man desire the office of a bishop, he desireth a good work. A bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, vigilant, sober, of good behavior, given to hospitality, apt to teach, not given to wine, no striker, not greedy of filthy lucre, but patient, not a brawler, not covetous, one that ruleth well his own house, having his children in subjection with all gravity. For if a man know not how to rule his own house, how shall he take care of the church of God? Not a novice, lest being lifted up with pride he fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must have a good report of them which are without, lest he fall into the reproach and the snare of the devil. Likewise, must the deacons be grave. Okay, and grave has to do with just having the right kind of an attitude, appropriate behavior, not double-tongued. You know, he's not telling this group of people one thing and he's going over here and changing up his story for another group because he's trying to impress them and win men to himself like Absalom, you know, or somebody like that. No, he's just telling it straight. He knows what's right and what's wrong and is doing the best he can. And so he's not double-tongued. I lost my place here. Not given too much wine, not greedy of filthy lucre, holding the mystery of the faith in a pure conscience. Now, you know, I don't believe, and I brought this up a little bit, and again, I think it was in Sunday school. I can't remember. I'm sure I brought it up in other messages, but I don't believe that when the Bible talks about pastors and it talks about deacons not being given to much wine, that means it's okay to have a little wine. Okay, I personally don't think any Christian should be touching alcohol at all. Okay, now, and especially a pastor or a deacon. And so, like, that's obviously debatable. Some people read that and they interpret that, oh, it's all right as long as you're not drunkard or you're not, just drinking all the time or something like that. But here's the thing, and I think most people in here know my take on this. In the Bible, a lot of times when it's talking about drinking wine, it's not even talking about alcohol. It's just talking about drinking those beverages that were made from grapes or whatever fruit. And so it would be, nowadays, it was hard to get those things back then. Nowadays, man, we can go get juice like for nothing, and we can get all kinds of, we can get pop and we can get all that. And so, like, I think that there's a certain element here when it's talking about not being greedy of filthy lucre and not, somebody who's temperate and all those kinds of things, that this idea of not being given to much wine has more to do with, like, not being somebody who has no temperance and is more like a glutton, okay? Like, they're just constantly just like, it's almost like a covetousness thing where they just want more and more and more. And so given to much wine would be somebody who's just constantly, indulging themselves with all the fancy things. I get a little convicted about that myself sometimes because I eat too much and I like, I don't know if you can call coffee wine, but I don't want to be given to much wine, but I drink a lot of coffee. So anyway, there's things, and let me just go, that's a good time to clear off a spot and say this. These are all qualifications of a pastor, but you know what? I don't think they're here so that people can, just find that one fault with the pastor that they don't like and say like, hey, I'm sure that is applicable to this little point right here, That's not the point of it. It's the overall package that you're getting in a person. You want to make sure that they're doing these things, and some of them only make sense. Like, why should a pastor have a wife and only one wife, not having had other wives and now he's got this wife? And why should he have children? Well, because he's leading a church of people who he needs to be able to talk about and to demonstrate what marriage is like and demonstrate what it's like to raise children and have your children in subjection and all that. So you want to make sure it's somebody who can practice what he preaches, so we're not talking about anybody who's perfect. Otherwise, we wouldn't have any pastors, and we're in a shortage of pastors in this world, of good pastors. And so, we're not talking about just trying to find a fault and eliminate them, but the reality is pastors should realize that, hey, I've got to live up to a higher standard and be able to demonstrate to other people the way that they should be living. And so all of us should be, following these things to the best of our ability. So it said, the deacon should not be grave, not double-tongued, not given to much wine, not greedy of filthy lucre, husband of one wife, ruling his children and his own house well. There's also some qualifications for the wife, which would also be part of that deacon running his house well. And then basically this idea of being blameless. All right, so you don't want to have things that everybody can just point and say, like, why would you want to follow this man because he's got X, Y, Z in his life, maybe some terrible thing in his past history or something like that. Again, we're not looking for perfection, but we're looking about people who can demonstrate these things. Okay, so be under the qualifications of a deacon. These qualities should be demonstrated before one uses the office. Okay, so we're not talking about like putting somebody in that office and then just like let's hope that it works out and let's prove them while they're in that office. I believe the biblical teaching is that this person has been observed for a certain amount of time. Now, I actually forgot that our bylaws say this, but I had this policy in my own mind that I'm never going to ordain anybody to any kind of an office like this, a deacon or another pastor to pastor another church or something like that, until I've observed them for at least a year so that I can make sure that they have demonstrated they're not jumping around, they're not just, especially like, let me just go ahead and be personal and talk about Brother Allen here. He came to our church from another church. You want to make sure you don't have somebody who's a church hopper, you know what I mean? Which in this case he wasn't. He was loyal to that church like the whole, for I don't know, how long were you there? Yeah, for 15 years. So he's not a church hopper, right? But you want to make sure like what caused him to leave that church, because sometimes, these questions need to be asked. And you don't know, like, what is the intention and stuff. And I could tell pretty easily by talking with Brother Allen. He was a good guy and everything. But I said, man, I'm not going to just jump into this. We want to make sure to observe things for about a year. And it's been over a year now. And so we're ready to go forward with this, not knowing exactly what the future holds. But I can tell you where I'm headed right now and what is the next step for us, okay? So these qualities have been demonstrated, and I want to say this last thing, that the office is one of commitment and dedication. Like I said, it's a place of servanthood. When you really start analyzing what a pastor's role is, what a deacon's role is, it's not really a sought-after position, all right? But not too many people are like, yeah, I want to be a servant. I want to be a slave. That's what I want to be for the rest of my life. No, it takes kind of a special type of person. And usually you can tell because that person just has a desire to do it and they demonstrate the abilities to do it. And so that usually manifests itself, okay? But it's a place of commitment and dedication, but it is a worthy office, okay? And if it's used properly, like we saw in verse 13, it reaps eternal rewards, okay? Now, let me show you here what I also shared with Iola. And again, I've kind of shared this with some of you guys before. With Brother Allen, I don't know how long ago it was, maybe a month ago or maybe longer. Time goes by so fast, but we sat down and I kind of shared with him my vision for the church, okay? Now I'm going to show you my vision in a perfect world. I'm going to show you my vision. If everything works out exactly like I would like for it to work out, that's just not necessarily going to be the case, okay? But that's all right. You have a plan, you have a vision, and then whatever happens from there, you're willing to adjust as the Lord leads. All right, so I want to start in this model that I'm demonstrating because I didn't ever have this vision until this work was already started, okay? But in a perfect world, in Iola, since Iola was this church is kind of birthed from Iola. In a perfect world, Iola would look like this. So I'm going to demonstrate that, and then I'll show you from there. Okay, so here's Iola. Iola Baptist Temple, but we're talking about Iola. All right. I'm just going to abbreviate here with letters. Okay, so I'm the pastor, so this is just in terms of government. It's not that I'm just like I am the church, I'm the head of the church. No, Christ is the head of the church. But in terms of authority, this is my job. So the church has to have a pastor, or it's not in order. Okay, Titus said, set in order the things that are wanting and ordain elders in every city. So, obviously that's the order of the church. There needs to be a pastor. It should be working towards that. And so it has to have a pastor. I think we've already talked about the office of the deacon, so I guess I don't have to do that. Let's just do this. The office of a deacon, ideally, there should be a deacon, okay, if needed. Now, currently in Iola, to be honest with you, I don't feel like there's really a need for a deacon. Like if it was just Iola, it's a small enough crowd that I can handle all the responsibilities that need to be taken care of in Iola for now. You know what I mean? Hopefully that won't always be the case. So in a manner of speaking, this is me and this is me, okay? Which is fine. That's not a complaint. It's just that's the way it is right now. But in an ideal world, we would be strong enough and have enough going on that I would need this man in Iola as well, okay? So I'm setting you what I think in a perfect world, what it would have looked like before this church got started. I would say basically right now where we are, there are basically three main categories here of the functions of what goes on in our church, okay? So number one, this is huge for us, and it should be for the church, is outreach, okay? So obviously a big portion of what we do as a church should be what we do outside these doors in terms of bringing people to Christ. That was the biblical mandate. That's what we're supposed to be doing. When we come into this church, we've got saved people who are being discipled. We're growing. We're learning how to read the Bible. We're learning how to study, learning how to love one another. We're learning all these things, learning how to go soul winning. And then outside this wall, like that's where we're doing the work. So obviously this is a huge thing, okay? So we do need to have, again, anybody can go soul winning. Anybody who's saved can tell somebody else how to get saved. I'm not concerned about, what goes on as far as that. But when our church is planning things like soul winning events or just our regular soul winning times, it would be good to have men who can head those times up. And of course, we've got guys that are doing that right now. But in this model that I'm laying out to you, I could delegate to the deacon or assistant pastor, this responsibility of overseeing the general functions of the church. Okay, maybe just one area or all areas or whatever. And so one of those areas would be the outreach, making sure that we got men that are doing that the way that they're supposed to. Another area would be the services, okay, and I'm just abbreviating. There's a whole lot of places that could go, but the services inside this church, so the preaching, the teaching, the song leading, the different things that go on inside the church. And then this is kind of new to our current society with the internet and all that, but I'm going to put media, okay? Nowadays, yes, a sound man would fit there as well, but somebody who is putting stuff online, making videos, for the stuff that we're promoting, making sure our materials are printed and ordered and maybe designing them or whatever the case, that's a function of the church. That's a need that we have right now. So I'm just going to put those three which represent everything that we do as a church, okay? And I'm not saying it all rests on this guy, but I'm saying that this guy, has the oversight, to make sure this happens. This is the guy that it rests on, I guess, essentially, right? So now let me bring you to the next step, if you will. Okay, so here we started KC Mission. And so in this case, let me just do a line right here. In starting this, again, I didn't originally have the vision, but it's just kind of how it happened, and now this whole model kind of makes sense to me. I'm the pastor over this work as well. And I'm looking for this guy. And we're looking for guys to head up these areas. All right, now, again, in a perfect world, if I had this guy, which I do, it's me, okay? But in a perfect world, if I had another guy that was this guy could also be overseeing this work over here, okay? And this guy right here, since we're talking about Kansas City Mission, we're talking about us right here, And my plan is to make this official here soon. Brother Allen's here right now. Let's put that's a pastor, but let's put a question mark right there, because in the long run we want to find this church a pastor. Okay. Now, hypothetically, because this has been brought up, people have said this. Well, what if you end up not being there anymore and you're here? That's a possibility. That's not what I have on the agenda. That's not what I think is going to happen. Certainly a possibility. What about this guy? Could he become the next pastor? Certainly. I'm not necessarily at this point saying that that's going to happen. It's definitely a possibility, and I've talked to Brother Allen about that. It could happen down the road. Who knows how long? But when the time's right and we're ready to move that he would go into that position, and we'd find somebody else to take this position. So let me throw another step into this, because I believe this is where we are. Okay, even though this isn't completely solidified yet, I believe that we should already be looking ahead at this. It's a mystery right now. Okay, we have nothing. We have nothing there, but it's going to look the same way. And the idea about even thinking this far ahead and making preparations and plans for it is just so that we're always on the move, and we're always planning, have this vision of planning churches and visions of going into different regions and checking them out and preaching the gospel and seeing what God's going to do, with an open mind that God could do what he did here in Kansas City. Like, we don't want to just grow stagnant and that be the end of it. We want that to be able to be duplicated. Now, I'm not saying necessarily it's all going to look exactly the same, but it could. Because what could happen is, let's say Brother Allen becomes a pastor, and then something happens between now and then, and he's like, yeah, I don't even think I want to do that. Well, here's the reality of it. At the point that we get a pastor right here, it's no longer, I'm not attached to it at all. That's an independent work, okay? And it's that pastor's authority. And so whatever he does is up to him at that point. But I think even right now, as we're talking about that, we could have our eye on that and trying to figure something out. It could be that Brother Allen, where there's another office, you could say, which is an evangelist. Okay, a missionary, a church planter. This was like the Apostle Paul. If we would have had ideally somebody in the church, maybe it was the deacon, maybe it was an extra guy who's not part of that. He could be coming over here and helping to lead this work. That's what the Apostle Paul did, and that's what he did with some guys that he had working for him under the authority of here. He wasn't actually acting as the pastor, but he was just kind of planning things and getting them started as an evangelist. So it could be that Brother Allen, and this is what we've talked about in the past, has got his eyes on something out here, and maybe he's going to be that guy. And then somebody else will take his position, or somebody else will take that position. I don't really know what all that's going to go. All I'm telling you right now is I want Brother Allen to be this guy right here, but I want you to know the vision, okay, and what we're hoping to accomplish down the road. Some of these things could change as we begin to talk and we begin to think about different things. But I've already talked to Brother Allen and shared this kind of my vision with him, and this is the way that I'm thinking things right now and wanting that to go. So, I just wanted to present that to you, show you what the Bible says about the office of a deacon. And I'm not, practically speaking, I'm already starting to give him authority. Like, this is already something that's in motion. But here, before too long, we'll have a day that this actually becomes official, and we talk about that. So, I guess I'll close the service, and then after live streaming's off and we're sitting around fellowship, if you got any other questions for me, then we can address them at that time. Okay, let's go to Lord in prayer. Father, thank you for this church and the work that you've started, and you are growing. You are leading us, and I pray that you would help us to just follow the Spirit, be sensitive to it, guide and direct us, help us know when we're in your will, and maybe whenever we begin to step out of it too, that you would just guide us and show us. And I pray, Lord, that you will strengthen the church, provide what we need in different areas of leadership and places where people serve within the church, responsibilities that are taken. Lord, I pray that you just give us what we need, give us the talents and the skills and abilities that we need as a church to have different members of the body. I pray for whatever work that you would have us do in the future, that you already start preparing those areas and those people so that we would know it whenever we see it, Lord, and just help us be prepared for it. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.